never imagined that the moment I'd be lying on a hospital bed, waiting for a surgery that could save my life, would also become the moment my family revealed who truly loved me. My name is Amelia, and when I needed just $5,000 for an emergency surgery, my parents, who had always preached about family unity, turned their backs on me. What broke me even more wasn't their refusal, it was who stepped forward instead. The brother everyone called broke, the one they never believed in, gave me everything he had and changed my life forever. My name is Amelia, and until that morning, I believed my life was ordinary in the quiet, predictable way that makes you feel safe. I had a routine, job that barely paid the bills, and a life partner, Daniel, who always told me that as long as we had each other, we could survive anything. That illusion shattered the moment I sat across from the doctor in a cold examination room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. The doctor's voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but his words landed like heavy stones in my chest. He explained that the persistent pain I had been ignoring wasn't stress or exhaustion. It was a serious condition that required urgent surgery. Without it, he said, the risks could become life-threatening. I remember nodding, pretending to understand, while my hands trembled in my lap and my heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. As he continued explaining the procedure, timelines, and recovery, my mind latched onto one number he mentioned almost casually: $5,000. That was the estimated cost of the surgery, excluding medications and follow-up care. $5,000 might as well have been $5 million to me. I felt dizzy, not just from the diagnosis, but from the crushing realization that my health had suddenly become a financial problem. I thought of Daniel already working overtime to cover rent and how we barely managed groceries at the end of each month. I thought of my parents, who always spoke about sacrifice and responsibility, about how family should always show up when it mattered most. Sitting there, staring at the doctor's moving lips, I clung to the belief that whatever happened next, my family would help me survive this. The ride home was a blur. Daniel tried to stay strong, squeezing my hand and telling me we'd figure something out, but I could hear the strain in his voice. That night, the pain flared again, sharper than before, curling through my body like a warning I could no longer ignore. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by fear-filled thoughts about hospitals, surgical lights, and the possibility that waiting too long could cost me more than money. By morning, I knew I had no choice but to ask for help. It wasn't pride that stopped me, it was shame. I hated the idea of being a burden, of having to explain my weakness to people who had always expected me to be strong. When I finally sat down with my parents, Richard and Margaret, my voice shook as I told them everything. I explained the diagnosis, the urgency, the cost, and how scared I was. My father's expression hardened as soon as money entered the conversation, his jaw tightening the way it always did when he felt inconvenienced. My mother listened quietly, arms crossed, eyes drifting toward the window as if she were already distancing herself from what I was saying. I waited for reassurance, for even a hint of concern, but instead there was silence, thick, uncomfortable, and heavy. The room felt smaller, the air harder to breathe, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. As I spoke, I realized how vulnerable I was in that moment, laying my fear bare in front of the very people who were supposed to protect me. Every word felt like a plea, even though I tried to keep my tone steady. I didn't ask for sympathy. I asked for help, believing that love would be enough to bridge the gap between what I needed and what I could afford. My sister Claire sat nearby, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up, but never once meeting my eyes. Her silence hurt almost as much as the pain in my body because it told me she had already decided not to get involved. The diagnosis wasn't just changing my health, it was quietly exposing cracks in my family that I had never wanted to see, and as I sat there waiting for a response, my fear deepened into something colder, heavier, and far more isolating. When my parents finally responded, it wasn't with the concern or urgency I had been bracing myself for, but with a cold calculation that made my stomach sink. My father, Richard leaned back in his chair and exhaled sharply, as if my illness were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. He asked questions, but none of them were about my pain, my fear, or what the surgery meant for my future. Every question circled back to money. How much exactly? Whether it could wait? Whether I had explored cheaper options? My mother, Margaret, nodded along, her lips pressed together in a tight line that told me she had already made up her mind before I even finished speaking. The room felt unnaturally quiet, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching my anxiety thinner. I tried again, explaining that the doctor had been clear about the urgency, that delaying the surgery could make things worse, that this wasn't cosmetic or optional. I reminded them of all the times they had told me family was everything, that blood should come before comfort, before savings accounts, before pride. My voice cracked despite my effort to stay composed, and I hated myself for it because vulnerability had never earned me much in that house. My father exchanged a look with my mother, the kind of look that said more than words ever could, and then he shook his head slowly. He said $5,000 was too much, that they had plans for their money, that emergencies happened and adults were expected to handle their own problems. Hearing him say the word adult felt like a slap, as if being grown meant being disposable when you were no longer convenient. My mother finally spoke, but her tone was detached, almost rehearsed. She suggested I take out a loan, ask friends, or pray for strength, as if faith could replace a surgeon's hands. She reminded me of all the expenses they had already carried over the years, subtly turning my illness into a debt I apparently owed them for raising me. I sat there stunned, trying to reconcile the people in front of me with the parents who once kissed, scraped knees, and promised they'd always be there. The contrast was so sharp it made my chest ache more than the condition itself. I felt small, reduced to a number on a balance sheet. My life weighed against their comfort and found lacking. What hurt most wasn't just the refusal, but how easily it came. There was no hesitation, no internal struggle, no emotional conflict visible on their faces. It was as if they had been waiting for a reason to say no, and now they finally had one that sounded logical enough to justify it. I glanced at my sister Claire, hoping she might say something, anything, but she avoided my gaze, her silence acting as quiet agreement. That silence echoed louder than any harsh word, reinforcing the feeling that I was standing alone in a room full of people who shared my blood, but not my pain. The humiliation crept in slowly, settling deep in my chest as I realized I had exposed my most fragile moment to people who saw it as a burden. I stood up to leave before the tears could fall, my legs trembling under my weight, my mind racing with disbelief and disbelief turning into a dull, burning ache. As I walked toward the door, my father reminded me not to hold this against them, saying they were just being practical, just being careful. His words followed me like a shadow, stripping away any last illusion that this was about love or concern. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt colder, heavier, and I understood that the pain of being refused help by strangers would have hurt less than being dismissed by the people who brought me into the world. 3. Keynote 3, A Sister Who Stayed Silent. The silence my sister Claire offered that day stayed with me long after I left my parents' house, pressing against my chest in ways I couldn't explain to anyone else. She had been sitting right there, close enough to reach out and touch me, close enough to hear the tremor in my voice and see the fear I was trying so hard to hide. Yet she chose to remain still, eyes lowered, fingers scrolling endlessly on her phone as if the screen in her hands mattered more than the sister standing in front of her, asking for help to stay alive. Claire had always been the peacekeeper, the one who avoided conflict at all costs, but in that moment, her need for comfort turned into quiet cruelty. Her silence wasn't neutral. It was a decision, and I felt it as clearly as if she had spoken the words herself. Growing up, Claire and I had shared a room, secrets whispered late into the night, promises that we'd always have each other's backs no matter what. I had defended her when our parents were harsh, covered for her when she made mistakes, and celebrated every small victory in her life as if it were my own. Remembering those moments made her quiet withdrawal even more painful because it showed me how easily shared history could be erased when standing up required courage. I kept waiting for her to look at me, to interrupt our parents and say something as simple as, "We'll figure this out together." But that moment never came. Instead, she sat frozen between loyalty and convenience, choosing the option that demanded nothing from her. When I later tried to talk to her alone, hoping maybe she had just been shocked or unsure what to say, she brushed it off with excuses that felt hollow. She said she didn't want to get involved, that it was between me and our parents, that money always caused problems and she didn't want to make things worse. Each sentence sounded reasonable on the surface, but underneath them was a refusal to share even a fraction of the emotional weight I was carrying. She didn't ask how I was coping with the diagnosis or whether the pain was getting worse. She didn't ask if I was scared. Her concern stopped at maintaining peace, even if that peace was built on my suffering. That realization hurt in a different way than my parents' rejection. Their refusal was blunt and obvious, but Claire's was subtle, wrapped in avoidance and soft words that disguised indifference as neutrality. It made me question every moment we had ever shared, wondering how many times I had been there for her while she quietly assumed I would always be strong enough not to need her in return. I felt foolish for expecting loyalty just because we shared the same childhood, the same parents, the same last name. In that quiet betrayal, I learned that love isn't always lost through cruelty. Sometimes it fades through silence, through the choice to look away when standing up would cost too much. And as I walked away from her that day, I carried with me the heavy understanding that I had just lost a sister long before losing any part of my health. Out of everyone in my family, the last person I expected to notice what was happening to me was my younger brother Ethan. He had always been labeled the disappointment, the one who never quite got his life together in our parents' eyes. Ethan bounced between jobs, lived in a small rented room on the edge of town, and carried a quiet kind of resilience that went unnoticed because it didn't come with a paycheck or impressive titles. At family gatherings, he was the punchline to subtle jokes, the example my father used when warning the rest of us about failure. I had grown used to seeing him shrink into the background, absorbing the criticism with a half smile that hid how deeply it cut him. In that house, being broke made you invisible. Ethan hadn't been part of the conversation when I asked our parents for help, but he had overheard enough to understand what was happening. Later that evening, he knocked on my door, his presence almost hesitant, as if he weren't sure he was welcome in my pain. He didn't come with advice or empty reassurances. He simply asked how bad it was and whether the surgery was truly necessary. When I told him the truth, that the doctors said waiting could make things worse, his face tightened with concern in a way I hadn't seen from anyone else that day. There was no judgment in his eyes, no calculation, just genuine worry that made my throat ache. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that feels heavy but safe, and I realized how rarely Ethan and I had been allowed moments like that growing up. He had learned early on that speaking too much invited criticism, so he listened instead, observing everything, storing away details others ignored. He told me he was sorry, not for being unable to help, but for how our parents had treated me. Hearing those words from him felt strange and grounding at the same time, because he wasn't trying to fix anything, he was acknowledging the hurt. That simple recognition made me feel less alone than I had all day. As he talked, I noticed how tired he looked, the lines of worry etched deeper than they should have been for someone his age. He admitted he was struggling too, that money was always tight and the future felt uncertain, but he said it quietly, without bitterness or self-pity. There was a humility in him that came from knowing what it was like to be overlooked and underestimated. I realized then that Ethan understood my fear better than anyone else in that family because he knew what it felt like to be dismissed when you needed support the most. In that moment, the ROA, few days after that conversation, when the pain had grown sharper and my anxiety heavier, Ethan asked me to meet him at a small cafe near the hospital. The place was quiet, almost empty, the kind of spot people chose when they wanted to talk without being overheard. He arrived early, sitting with his hands wrapped around a cup of tea he barely touched, his shoulders tense in a way that immediately told me something was different. I assumed he wanted to check on me again, maybe offer emotional support, because that was all he had ever been able to give. Money had never been part of Ethan's vocabulary, not in a family where it was used as a measure of worth. Without much small talk, he reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the table toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at, and when he told me to open it, I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of mistake. My hands started shaking as I counted the cash inside, my mind refusing to process the numbers lining up in front of me. $5,000. Exactly! 5,000! My breath caught in my chest as I stared at him, waiting for him to explain how this was possible, certain there had to be a misunderstanding. Ethan looked embarrassed, his eyes dropping to the table as he told me it was everything he had. He explained that he had been saving quietly for years, picking up extra shifts, skipping meals, turning down nights out, all to build a small safety net he hoped would one day help him escape the constant instability of his life. That money was supposed to be his way out, his chance to finally prove to everyone, especially our parents, that he wasn't a failure. He spoke calmly, but I could hear the weight of that sacrifice in every word, and it crushed me to realize what he was giving up for me. I tried to refuse, panic rising as I imagined him starting over from nothing, but he shook his head before I could finish. He told me money could be earned again, but a life couldn't be replaced once it was lost. There was no hesitation in his voice, no expectation of gratitude or repayment, just a quiet certainty that this was the right thing to do. I felt tears spill down my face, not just from relief, but from the overwhelming contrast between his choice and our parents' refusal. The brother everyone dismissed had just given me more than money. He had given me proof that love didn't need abundance to be real, and as I held that envelope in my hands, the meaning of family shifted in ways I was only beginning to understand. We'd been assigned by our parents, successful daughter, silent sister, failed son, felt meaningless, and what remained was the bond between two people who had learned to survive neglect in different ways, sitting together in the aftermath of a rejection that had cracked our family wide open. The days leading up to my surgery passed in a strange haze, filled with paperwork, hospital visits, and a quiet, emotional reckoning I wasn't prepared for. With Ethan's money safely deposited, the hospital suddenly treated me differently. Appointments were scheduled faster, nurses smiled more often, and the looming threat of delay finally lifted. Yet beneath the relief, there was a persistent ache that had nothing to do with my condition. Every form I signed, every instruction I received, reminded me that the reason I was here wasn't because my parents had stepped up, but because the one person everyone underestimated had chosen to stand in the fire for me. That truth followed me everywhere, heavy and undeniable. My parents didn't call to check on me before the surgery. When they finally found out that the procedure was moving forward, their reaction was muted, almost suspicious, as if they were trying to calculate how I had managed it without them. My father asked a few vague questions. My mother offered a brief, "Hope it goes well," and neither of them asked how I was feeling or whether I was scared. Their distance no longer surprised me, but it still hurt in a dull, lingering way, like pressing on a bruise will never fully heal. I realized that whatever bond I thought we shared had been conditional all along, dependent on convenience rather than care. Claire reached out once, sending a short message wishing me luck and telling me she hoped everything would work out. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her silence, just a carefully neutral gesture that allowed her to feel involved without actually stepping into discomfort. I read the message several times, trying to find warmth in it, but it felt hollow, stripped of the closeness we once had. I understood then that some people don't abandon you loudly. They fade out quietly, preserving their own peace while you carry the consequences alone. That understanding didn't bring anger so much as clarity, and clarity, I learned, can be just as painful. Ethan, on the other hand, showed up in ways that felt almost unreal. He sat with me in the waiting area on the morning of my surgery, cracking nervous jokes and pretending not to be scared, even though I could see it in his eyes. When they called my name, he squeezed my hand and told me he'd be right there when I woke up. his voice steady despite everything he had given up to make this moment possible. In that instant, I saw him not as the broke brother my parents talked about, but as the strongest person in my family, someone who understood that love wasn't about security or recognition, but about choosing someone else's survival over your own comfort. As I lay in the hospital bed afterward, drifting in and out of sleep, fragments of memory and realization blended together. I thought about how often we're taught to equate success with worth, money with responsibility, and how easily that belief can strip people of compassion. My parents had resources but withheld them. Ethan had nothing and gave everything. That contrast reshaped the way I understood family, loyalty, and sacrifice. Blood, I realized, doesn't guarantee protection, and titles like mother, father, or sister don't automatically come with empathy or courage. Recovery forced me to slow down, giving me time to sit with truths I might have otherwise ignored. I stopped reaching out first, stopped explaining myself, stopped trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Instead, I focused on the people who had shown up without being asked, who had offered support without conditions. Daniel stayed by my side through every difficult moment. Ethan visited whenever he could, and in that small circle of genuine care, I felt safer than I ever had in my childhood home. The surgery healed my body, but what followed began reshaping my heart, teaching me that sometimes the family you survive is not the one you were born into, but the one that proves, through action and sacrifice, that your life is worth everything. Looking back on everything that happened, I no longer see my surgery as the most defining moment of that chapter in my life. What truly changed me was the clarity that came with it, the painful but necessary understanding of who would stand beside me when love demanded sacrifice. I learned that support doesn't always come from those who claim authority in your life, and that sometimes the people with the least to give are the ones who give the most without hesitation. My parents' refusal stripped away the illusion I had carried for years, while Ethan's choice rebuilt something stronger in its place. Trust grounded in action, not words. The experience reshaped how I measure loyalty, how I understand family, and how I value myself. I stopped begging for validation from people who saw me as an expense and started honoring the ones who saw me as irreplaceable. In surviving that moment, I didn't just heal physically. I learned that love reveals itself most clearly when everything else falls away.